Welcome to the Diversity Pivot Podcast. I'm your host, Julie Kratz. I am thrilled you are here with us today. Our purpose is to share stories, ideas, and tools to help you on your diversity, equity, and inclusion journey. Let's meet this week's guest. Hello, listeners. We have a special guest with us this week. Kurt Landon is the founder and CEO of Enspira. Enspira is an LGBTQ plus owned HR services, talent acquisition, and tech consulting firm. With decades of human resources experience, Enspira partners with clients to maximize business results and provides innovative practices and solutions that enable people and organizations to thrive. And they've worked with over 160 organizations of various sizes, maturity, and industry. And Kurt's joining us as their CEO. He has nearly 30 years of HR and business experience as an innovative entrepreneur himself that's operated 3 successful companies. And he's held senior level roles with Accenture, Pfizer, Johnson & Johnson, Expedia, Biogen, and Pinterest. Oh, there's a couple of our clients on that list. Fun. Kurt also studied and lived in 4 regions, 8 countries, 16 cities, and speaks 5 languages. Holy smokes. And he holds an undergrad degree in Italian language and international economics, an advanced degree in global HR leadership. He is also a frequent guest lecturer at universities on the topic of human capital considerations for growth businesses. Kurt, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Julie. It's great to be with you.
What a cool set of experiences you have. Before we dive in to the great work that you get to do with organizations, love our listeners to hear your story. How did you get into this line of work? How did you yourself find yourself passionate about diversity, equity, and inclusion?
Well, stories of human resources leaders and how they got into the field of HR are always interesting because it seems like no one ever took a straightforward path to get there, and I'm no exception. So I actually started off my career as a software engineer with Accenture back in the 90s. So it was Anderson Consulting, and then migrated from there over to their human capital practice as a consultant, and then got into internal corporate HR. And once I got into internal corporate HR, I knew that I had sort of found my calling and spent the rest of the majority of career in HR with different organizations, including the ones that you mentioned. And then about 5 years ago, I decided to start my own firm, Enspira. And it's been an incredible journey for these last 5 years or so.
Yeah, it's never the right time to start a business. It's never the wrong time either, but it's that kind of gut check of like, am I ready? Like, how am I going to show up in this space? What are clients going to look like? I feel like those are fun questions, but sometimes scary ones too.
Indeed.
Um, Tell our listeners, somebody that's an out, gay man leading an organization. I'd love for you just to, tell our listeners how does that part of your identity show up in the work you do as well?
That's a great question. Maybe I'll back into that with just a little bit in the way of background of my early life experiences, sort of those formative years that we all know shape who we are as leaders. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area, was born into an amazing family, very progressive and free thinking. However, I like to joke around that I was raised by a pack of wolves because I was one of 6 boys. Our mother, she deserves anything she wants in life now after successfully raising all of us. But I was the only and am the only one out of the 6 who identifies as being gay. And I love my brothers, but there was a lot of hyper masculinity, maybe even at times sort of toxic masculinity going on in our household. So it was a little bit like growing up in a fraternity house. And we all shared one bathroom, believe it or not. So still have war wounds from that. But there were a lot of times, if not all the time, where I really felt different to the point of feeling like I didn't belong even in my own household, even though it was such a loving environment. I just that feeling of difference also translated into not feeling a sense of belonging. And then to compound that, I went to just this sort of obnoxious all boys private prep school that lacked all kinds of diversity whether it be socioeconomic diversity, racial diversity, and certainly around sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. And so I really felt very much a sense of lack of belonging in my day life at school, and then my evening life when I would come back home. And so all those formative years were felt, uh, were really filled with a lot of feelings of not feeling like I belonged and was part of those communities at home and at school. Um, Now, interestingly enough, and I'm not a psychologist, but I'm sure there's some interesting psychology to this. Uh, Given that those were aspects of my experience that I didn't choose, I did choose to then put myself in even more situations where I didn't feel a sense of belonging. And so, growing up in the Washington D.C. area, it's such a global city. I went to school with children of diplomats, and had a lot of diversity in terms of social friendships that I had. And my mind was always drawn to, my mind and my heart were always drawn to all things outside of the US. And so I studied Japanese language as a kid, studied in Japan, studied Italian language in university, studied in Italy, and then went on to live and work multiple times in different countries and regions around the world. And when you do that, as you know, Julie, and I'm sure as your listeners know, you inherently feel a lack of belonging because you are the outsider coming into these cultures in different parts of the world. And so I'm sure it's not by coincidence that I felt this very familiar sense of lack of belonging and then double, triple down on that through all these experiences over the years. So I just think really understanding what it feels like to not belong and then honing sort of the attributes of resilience and empathy were things I had to really learn very early on in my life that are really, I think, germane to the kind of work that I do today.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that primal need to belong in your home, in other cultures, and feeling different. Well, it's a positive quality to be different and unique. Of course, we want to be unique, but you know what I can only imagine what it must have felt like for you growing up with all your brothers and being in these different, growing up in these, being in these different countries where it's like you feel like the other, like
Yes.
I'm the one that's different. And so wanting to create and be a part of cultures where everyone feels a sense of belonging and people can feel the things that you didn't always get to feel based on things outside of your control. That totally makes sense, full circle, how you arrived in this work, Kurt. Um, I'm curious from your vantage point today, having spent time in different cultures and a lot of different industries and helping people with human capital, human issues in the workplace. Where are we at right now? If you had to kind of like hone in on the overall conversation on inclusion and diversity, spring of 2023, like what is in your mind, what is the current state?
Well, I think there's so many examples of ways in which the conversation has evolved and great progress has been made. And then equally, I find myself highly concerned that things are moving in the wrong direction. And I think those two things, holding those in parallel, is what I observe and how I feel. I think among some people, there's a potentially overt sense of complacency that we've sort of arrived and that the world is progressive. And I think there are, again, many examples of where that's the case. And I think there are an equal number of cases where things are headed in the wrong direction. And so I think the cause for concern and the need for more work and progress in this space is really warranted. And then, with that said, part of what's complex is that the ground is moving so quickly under our feet on all these topics of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. In part because of massive public health issues related to the pandemic, in part because of some of these events and issues that are coming into our workplaces and into our homes that are really forcing the conversation for people to have to state what they believe in and where their values and philosophies reside. And I feel that is more present than any time I've ever recalled in my life and my career. Growing up in the 70s and 80s and my formative years at work in the 90s, there was sort of clear separation of church and state, so to speak, and you didn't talk about politics and religion and controversial social issues at work. Obviously, most of that is out the window now, and employees expect employers and leaders to have a point of view on all of these really tough things, and then that can be a catch-22 because inevitably, in taking a position on something, there will be large swaths of the population that don't agree with that point of view. And so I think it starts with really a lot of self-reflection to understand where do we know about certain issues and where do we need to learn more? Because anyone who thinks they've got all these issues figured out, I would challenge that and say there's so much continuous learning that needs to happen because these issues are so complex, and again, because they're evolving so fast.
Yeah, I really like how you laid that out. The word that came to mind as you were explaining, whether it was the personal and professional blender that we're in, the lack of separation of church and state, and just the complexity of these issues, is the word that came to mind to me was paradox, that
Yes.
it's a both and conversation. I've always felt like diversity work was fun because of that. But it's
Yes.
also like really challenging because it's hard for our brains to hold two truths at one
Yes.
time. Like
It's a
we
more
can't.
sophisticated skill set, right? To be able to hold two things seemingly contradictory and parallel. And just to build on that, one of the other things that occurred to me recently, I was actually having a conversation with my father, who is amazing and hugely supportive of me, including my sexual orientation, but probably left to his own devices, skews a little bit more conservative on most of these issues. And we had this incredibly emotionally intimate conversation about matters of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And I had this aha in that conversation that maybe there's a sort of lead that we can follow that's been sort of initiated through the LGBTQ plus community and conversation around all things binary versus non-binary. And what I mean by that is that, when we think of the term binary, non-binary, most people associate that with matters of gender and or sexual orientation. But I also think it can be applied to a way of thinking about complex issues. And if we think about them in a less binary way and more of a continuum based way, so continua or dials as opposed to switches, I think there's goodness that can come from that, and the conversation can be more robust. So even if you're talking to someone who, let's say, has a lot of concerns and issues with gender identity and expression, talking about that issue instead of do you agree with it or disagree with it, do you feel it's right or do you feel it's wrong, but rather talking about to what extent does it resonate with you and fit with your ideology, or to what extent do you have concerns with it, I think opens up the conversation to a much richer dialogue.
I agree. Yeah, the continuum, the spectrum, the
Yes.
non-binary. Yeah, because if we jump right in the deep end with like, you got to share your pronouns. Oh,
Yes.
I've gotten that huge resisted, especially from
Oh yeah.
straight white guys. They're like, "Are you kidding me, Julie?
Oh
Like,
yes.
I don't even think that belongs. That conversation shouldn't even happen at work." That's
Yes.
the polar defensiveness you get sometimes. And then I find when, like, it's funny that you use that metaphor of a dial, because I find when you dial in and say, "Well, have you ever talked to somebody that's identifies as non-binary?" And the answer is almost always no.
No.
Chances are you do know somebody. And then I usually pepper in some stats about Gen Z. Did you know 31%
Yes.
identify as LGBTQ? It's like, did
Right.
you know? Like,
Right.
did you know that the American Press Style Book is said they, them is appropriate use for a singular human?
Yes.
Like, it's just,
Well
you
said.
little strings, little drips, rather than like
Yes.
smacking somebody over the head with information. Because
Right.
I find that pendulum swings hard, and people revert and get defensive when they don't like something that you've
Right.
said, or you're asking too
That's
much too
right.
quickly. So yeah, how can we just nudge and meet each other in the middle? And that's, I think, where embracing paradox really resonates, because you could agree that you love your father and you have a lot in common, and you have different opinions about things that probably matter a lot to you too. I mean, both of those things can be true.
That's right.
Kurt, I know that the allyship journey is I myself make a lot of stumbles and bumbles and like the mistakes we make along the way and the experiences watch witness of others making mistakes. We all have those stories of like courage or like when things didn't go well. I'd love for you to share your experiences with allyship and what's worked and not worked along the way.
Well, I think, like a lot of human resources professionals, uh, we like to think of ourselves as being experts on the topic of allyship. And I think I've learned a lot about what allyship really means and also where there are opportunities that still exist, really based on some formative experiences that I've had in my life and my career. And there's one really pivotal experience that I had professionally, which I would say was sort of the rock bottom of my experience as an openly gay executive. And I'll leave the company name out and obviously the individual's names out just to protect the innocent, or in this case, the guilty. But um, one of my prior employers, I was doing really, really well with that organization. I considered top talent. I was in a number two to the chief people officer role and had a tremendous amount of responsibility. And my development plan was moving everything in the right direction of one day being the chief people officer. So I was the seated successor to the existing chief people officer, had a great relationship with the CEO. The CEO was very supportive of one day soon working with me as their chief people officer, and so kind of on top of the world from a career perspective. And I love the organization. What happened next, I think, is chock full of all kinds of lessons learned and interesting insights. So, what happened is that CEO left and went to another organization, and a new CEO came in. And unfortunately, the new CEO who came in was very vocal behind the scenes, not to my face, but very vocal behind the scenes, that he did not want to work with me as his future chief people officer. Why? Because he knew that I was gay, and in his mind, his perspective, his value system and philosophy and ideology was that gay people and pedophiles were the same. And this is kind of shocking to even talk about or hear, that someone in, even though this wasn't yesterday, relatively contemporary times, that a senior executive not only would believe that and feel that way, but also would have the uh, uh, impetus or the
The
wherewithal to go and
audacity
talk
to
about the
say that out
audacity, better,
loud.
yes, better
Sorry
word,
to
to
fill in
say
there.
that
I was
out
like,
loud.
I'm
No, I was looking for the right
gasping
word
for
because
words too. Sheesh.
and and so obviously I think your listeners would, I'm sure, agree that conflation of being gay and being a pedophile is just outrageous. For me, that was personally so disturbing to hear, because even though I don't have children myself, I'm the proud godfather of 8 godsons whose parents entrust me fully if something should ever happen to them. And kids are a huge part of my life. I mean, I teach. I have been a camp counselor. I actually started a summer camp many years ago. Kids are just a huge part of what motivates me to be a good human in the world. And so the audacity of anyone to conflate those two things is offensive, but it's also, as we all know, incredibly inaccurate. I mean, just to use data as our friend here, almost 100% pedophiles in the world are not LGBTQ plus. And so it's just a comment that's based in ignorance. And so essentially when that happened, that information was shared with me, and I immediately felt such a sense of fear, of despair, and really of feeling very lonely. There was no one I could go and speak with. And that was a time where I really needed allyship more than ever. And so there were, like many cases of hardship, there's so many good things that came out of this situation. One, I went on to do other things that maybe I wouldn't have done professionally if that hadn't happened. I went on to become a chief people officer. I went on to start a company. And so sometimes that challenge and obstacle can cause you to do really great things. But it also, I think, gave me a sense of empathy that I might not have had before. So I always thought that I really understood how people felt who were being marginalized, discriminated against, etc. But unless you've really lived through that, I would assert that it may be sympathy and not empathy that you're feeling. And especially as a senior executive at that point in time, I really felt that there was no one I could speak with. And I would have all these one-on-ones and routine conversations. I was leading the LGBTQ employee resource group. I was interacting with the chief diversity officer of the company. I was out speaking and on panels and touting how wonderful of a company this was from a diversity perspective. And yet that was very incongruent with what I was experiencing on a daily basis. And if you talk to most people who've been the victims of marginalization, discrimination, homophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, that dissonance is something that on a daily basis at work can be incredibly confounding and disorienting. And so one of the good things that came from that is an idea that I've actually been tossing around with my team, which is, if you go to the doctor, like I did a week ago, they ask me the same 5 questions every time I go to the doctor. The nurse practitioner or physician's assistant will say, have you slipped and fallen recently? Do you ever have feelings of despair? How much are you drinking and smoking each week? Just the standard set of 5 questions. And my standard answer is no, 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 no to all these things. There should be some analog to that in the place where every time you're interacting with a member of management or leadership, or every time you're interacting with someone in human resources, there's a standard set of questions that are asked proactively to check in with you. Now, people may bite or they may not, but something like, and back to our conversation about continua versus, switches, to what extent do you feel a sense of belonging in the organization today? To what extent do you feel a sense of being marginalized or a lack of belonging? Or are you the subject of discrimination, racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, etc., misogyny today based on your employment experience? And then not just listen for the answer, because people may be quick to answer negatively, or sorry, and that they're not experiencing those hardships because of, it doesn't feel safe to answer. But what's the facial expressions? What are the nonverbals? What's not being said? And then pull on those threads where it makes sense. I think if someone had asked if the right person had asked those questions at the right time, I might have actually taken the leap to engage in conversation and felt a whole lot less alone. And maybe something could have been done about it. But no one ever asked. And I certainly didn't feel comfortable proactively self-disclosing. And we know that most people who are in situations like that do not proactively share that or ask for allyship. And so how do you infuse allyship to a population of people who are most in need of it, but may not be asking for it, I think is where we can elevate the allyship conversation.
I love those questions, Kurt. And I love the proactive component of it too. To us, it seems obvious that managers, leaders are responsible for the culture, and that means diversity and inclusion inside your organization. But they're often not asking those questions, and they're afraid, I think, of what the answers could be, because then now I've got a problem I need to solve. But you still have the problem if you're not asking the questions and you're not getting the most from your people. Like when you had that happen, I can only imagine, I can only empathize with your situation of not feeling safe.
Yes.
You're certainly not bringing your best ideas. You're certainly not solving more problems. You're probably just doing the bare minimum to get your work done, because when human beings don't feel safe, we don't stay places where we don't feel like we belong, because we don't feel safe for obvious reasons. This isn't a nice to have. It's really a must have for our survival. So I love those check-in questions. So leaders take note, ask about the perceptions of belonging on the team. Ask about how included people feel. I personally, one of my favorite is like, what's one thing I could do to be more supportive or more inclusive as a leader?
Yes.
And just because when we ask for feedback, like what am how am I doing? No one answers that question.
That's
right. Especially if there's power at play. You're scared. But
That's
what's
right.
one thing I could do to be more inclusive, or what's one thing our organization could do to be more inclusive for you? The richness of that conversation alone, even if you can't do something about the problem, which most of the time it's very simple asks that people have. But even if you don't, like listening to somebody and hearing their story so they don't feel alone. Because what I heard in your story is you felt very lonely and you didn't have a
Hmm.
safe place. You didn't have any allies to confide in. And can only imagine what that could feel like. And the other thing I'd add is, as we think about Pride Month, LGBTQ Pride here in the United States is in June. And one of the things I think you can do to be a better ally, and I'd love to hear your ideas, Kurt, just get more educated. The story that you shared is not unusual, unfortunately. If you listen to the stories of folks in the LGBTQ plus community, the amount of homophobia that's still very prevalent and very much overt, like your story, is still all too common. The documentary I watched that was very eye-opening for me was Disclosure by
Hmm.
Laverne Cox about the
It's
trans
excellent.
community. It's really good because it helped me understand how trans folks have been inappropriately cast as villains and serial killers, and just it's created a stigma. And I'm not saying that's that CEO's excuse for like that connection, but there's a reason these fear connections are manufactured. And like you said, it's
Yes.
100% not true. But because we see these images and we have been conditioned, especially if we're older, we've seen more of those harmful images. I mean, I just had a friend share with me recently that her 8-year-old son used gay as a pejorative. I thought that
Mhm.
was done in the
All
90s. Like,
right. Right.
what?
That's so gay. Right. Yeah, exactly.
Yes. Like, what? And like the first thing she was like, well, why is that a bad thing? And
Right.
like, what is
Right.
happening? I thought we were, how did this get repeated like from my generation? So I think just being really careful with history has a tendency to repeat itself. And when people don't understand things, they fill it in with fear and usually incorrect information, as in your case.
Yes.
Kurt, to wrap us up, thinking about allyship and thinking about LGBTQ plus and just your experiences, what do you wish more allies would do more of to honor and celebrate the community?
Well, I think certainly what we've talked about around proactive allyship and looking for opportunities to demonstrate effective allyship, even when it's not apparent or requested. I think that's one. I think two, allyship does not just have to be from individuals who don't self-identify as being part of that community to people who are identifying as being part of that community. So, for example, I know within the LGBTQ plus uh, population and topic, oftentimes people, if they think of allies, they think of, let's say straight ally. But I think there's sometimes allyship that's really needed from LGBTQ plus individual to other LGBTQ plus individual. And I think, unfortunately, we see the same thing when it comes to matters of race. There's a lot of divisiveness within these communities. And so, whether it be between the trans community and gay men and lesbians, between the lesbian community and gay men, there's a lot of allyship that could be very powerful and impactful within those communities. And then I think, just broadening out for a moment beyond allyship itself, I think just this entire space that we're talking about today is evolving so fast. And I think really kind of thinking ahead about what are the needs going to be and the issues going to be in the not too distant future. And I think understanding and forecasting how things are evolving is really important because for allies to do their best work as allies, I think they need to know what's coming and begin preparing for that, almost honing their own allyship skill sets so that they can be ready to serve the people who need their allyship most. And there are a couple of areas where I think we're headed on the diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging front. And so, one I think is any and all things related to mental health and well-being will become even more prevalent. Two, I think anything in the space of neurodivergent talent, I think is a really big area to further understand And then one of the ones that I think is going to be very interesting comes from, I think, taking a page of what we're seeing in schools right now. And I think the conventional wisdom is that workplaces populated by adults sort of lead the way, and then what happens with schools populated by children comes next because of the natural world order. But I actually think most of the research, as you know, tells us the opposite, which is younger generations actually inform and lead the way for older generations. And for your listeners who have kids, one of the prevalent issues going on regarding diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging in schools, as you know, is this increasing number of children in schools who identify as alternate species or even inanimate objects. The child who comes home from school and says, my classmate identifies as a cat and is requesting a litter box. And, as my friend is identifying as a chair and wants to be interacted with as a chair. And there's several really interesting things I think to take from this. One is, if we look at our own reactions, myself included, as we talk about this, I am hearing and sometimes even saying things like, come on, there have to be limits somewhere. What's the next thing that's going to happen? And that eerily reminds me of things that have been said over the course of time about trans people and about gay people, which is a man is supposed to be with a woman and a woman is supposed to be with a man. And, what's the next thing that's going to happen? People are going to be allowed to marry sheep, right? And it's a very similar conversation. It's, you don't get to pick your species. You don't get to pick whether you're a living being or an inanimate object. But we say these things reflexively because we don't understand them, because we're afraid of them. It seems very far-fetched. But how is that any different than the conversation I have with my dad in the pool, where he's saying, last time I checked, you don't get to pick your gender. And last time I checked, a man is supposed to be with a woman, etc. And so it's dangerously close. And I think what's going to happen is this issue is going to make its way into the workplace. And so if it's not happening already, employers will quickly be expected to figure out how to accommodate that employee who's requesting a litter box at work because they identify as a cat. And again, it seems far-fetched, but it's coming. And if we're not prepared for that, then it's going to be the same thing as 10 years ago when we had the first employee in the workplace who said, I am experiencing gender dysphoria and I'm going through a gender transition, and I expect you, employer, to accommodate this. And I have doctors' documentation demanding that. That could absolutely happen on this topic. And so what did we learn from that situation back then around gender identity and expression is that employers have to be one step ahead. They have to already have been thinking about how to handle that. There has to be philosophical alignment within the organization about how the organization is going to show up for that person. And so my advice is, as far-fetched as that topic may seem as an issue facing employers, mark my words, it's coming. Prepare now. Use the prior sort of rubric and approach that was determined in your organization around gender transition, and think about that for issues like this. And then after that, it's going to be another thing and another thing. And this is just the way the world is headed. Is we, I think, are challenged with how do we embrace everyone for who they are, even if we don't understand it. And I think kindness goes a long way to creating a sense of belonging for all people.
Yeah. Yeah. That is an interesting issue you brought up. And, at first my reaction is the same. And you made a really great comparison to how we looked at trans and how we looked at LGBTQ, 20, 30 years ago. We normalize the rules, and
Right.
whether that's gender, sexual orientation, like you said, inanimate objects, like it will be very interesting because I firmly believe this next generation is well positioned to create long-lasting positive social change because they care about it. They've been exposed to it
Yes.
more, and they have a heck of a lot more power than past generations did, just because labor force and the shortage you and I are
Yes.
helping companies with. So hopefully they actually have the power for change. We need to listen to them. I mean, you think about the cat thing. Like, why would someone make that up? Like, I don't
Right.
know. Like,
Right.
what are we so afraid of? Like, what
Right.
harm does that do to anybody? As I unpack it, it's like,
Right.
because I don't understand it. That's what the
Correct.
problem is I don't get it. So therefore I'm scared and I want to make it more difficult for somebody because of my own
Right.
fear. Like,
Well, and why is the first reflex we have as fellow humans that, oh, that's attention seeking, or oh, that's
right.
made up? We should probably feel relieved and grateful that you and I think, I'm assuming you and I don't wake up every morning feeling dissonance between what we see in the mirror and what species we are, or the fact that I wake up and I feel like I'm a chair, but I actually am a human. That must be really hard to wake up and
I
not
can't
even
imagine.
feel a sense of, alignment with
Yeah.
what species you are, because I know how hard that is around sexual orientation. And I have a bit of a sense of that from a gender identity perspective through the work that I've done in that space. But I can't even imagine what that must feel like. So, why is our natural reflex to have disdain, even anger about it, as opposed to that must be so hard for that individual if that's what
Empathy.
they're experiencing, right? And you're right, it comes back to empathy.
Yep. Yeah, that's a good cue. When you start to feel viscerally like uncomfortable or that fear starts to flood your body, that cortisol, hormone
Yes.
coming in, rather than judge, rather than shame, rather than like, is this too much? I can't handle it. It's like, just cool the jets, take a breath.
Yeah.
And
Choose kindness, compassion, empathy. It doesn't mean you have to understand it fully
no,
or even agree with it,
right.
but it's probably going to lead to a better outcome of bringing the world a little bit closer together if we choose the former rather than the latter. So,
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. It's not going to do more harm. Yes.
right.
Oh, Kurt, this has been fascinating. Thank you so
Yes.
much for bringing such interesting stories to the podcast today. Tell our listeners how can they follow you? How can they stay in touch with your work?
Thanks, Julie. Thanks again for having me too. So really proud of the work we're doing at Enspira. Certainly going to our website is a great place to find information about what we do, but also we have a lot of free resources and materials there for everyone to take part of. And so our website is inspirahr.com. And that's probably the best way to reach us. We also have a great LinkedIn page and we're on social media. And so welcome anyone to interact with us and to be in touch to continue the conversation.
Awesome. We'll link to that in the show notes. And thanks, Kurt. Thanks for sharing your story with us. So thankful for having you on.
Thanks for having me, Julie.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. If you liked what you heard, consider hiring Julie and the Next Pivot Point team to come speak at your organization's next event. We speak on a range of topics from active allyship to inclusive leadership to how to create a culture where everyone feels seen, heard, and feels a sense of belonging. Thank you for being on this journey with us. Go to nextpivotpoint.com to learn more.